The various organizations from business, chambers, civil society, and businesses as well as individuals are making submissions on the Eskom application for tariff hikes. A question has been asked: should Eskom be punishing consumers with higher tariffs for its failures? 072-110-5584. Do weigh in on that tonight. Otherwise, you can tweet us at Newzroom 405. That's the conversation we'll be having with our panel in the next couple of minutes. First, though, let's have a look right now at what's making news. The founder of the Inkatha Freedom Party, Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, has been hospitalized. Police Minister Bheki Cele confirms that arrests of 8 people in connection with 2 mass shootings that took place in KwaZulu-Natal earlier this month. And 3 of Cape Town's wetlands remain closed off to public due to an E. coli outbreak.
I think firstly the 400 billion debt, a large function of that is building Medupi, Kusile and Ingula. And you will recall that when Eskom started that build program, we didn't get, like a normal business will get a share injection in terms of a rights issue. And the assumption was made that prices were going to increase earlier. So effectively, as we incurred the capital expenditure on those programs, it built up the debt in the balance sheet where we find it now. We acknowledge, yes, around corruption and fraud. As the new board and management, we are addressing that. You've seen certain recoveries, criminal charges we've placed, and also through the Zondo Commission reports that will come out end of January, end of February. The board, we're very clear, we need to deal with it, but we also need law enforcement agencies to come to the conclusion. And last but not least, when Eskom recovers from these fraudulent activities, we then give it back to the consumer in subsequent applications.
Good to have you with us tonight here on this Wednesday night. I am Thabo Mhluli, and that's the conversation tonight. Amid a public outcry, Eskom is pushing for a 20.5% tariff increase, which begs the question, are South Africans being punished for the power utilities' failures? Joining me now to unpack this is General Manager for Regulation at Eskom, Hasha, Tlhotlhalemaje, Eskom Executive Director at the Southern African Faith Communities Environment Institute, Francesca Gasparis, Secretary of the Climate Justice Coalition and campaigner with the 350 Africa, that is Dr. Alex Lenferna, as well as energy expert Ted Blom. You're a part of this conversation tonight, answering that very question tonight on WhatsApp or otherwise on Twitter. Should Eskom be allowed to punish consumers with a tariff hike for its failures? Good evening to you all, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus. Hasha, let's begin with Eskom and just get the sense from Eskom how you feel about this, right? People are already reeling under the pressure of COVID-19. It's likely that they're going to have to cut from somewhere else in their homes just to be able to afford energy. And when you look at some of your presentation, the business chambers in particular are saying some of what you're claiming for are consequential damages that are brought about by the fact that you overran by 100 billion at least on Medupi and Kusile. Should the consumers be paying for this? Please unmute for us if you can. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yes, thanks very much for the opportunity. But let us clarify, first of all, that what Eskom applies for is only efficient costs. So that is the role of NERSA, to make sure that only efficient costs are recovered. And there are particular formulas, etc., that are used to determine what this is. And if you look at Eskom's own costs, and that will be mainly primary energy and what we call operating costs. The increase on these are between 5 and 8% in this particular financial year and over the period that is being applied for. So what is causing the more substantial increase is costs that are not under Eskom's direct control. And that includes the independent power producers as well as the introduction of carbon tax. But before I also want to clarify that, we all know about Medupi, Kusile, etc. But you would see in our application that what the consumer paid for Medupi, Kusile, and Ingula from a capital point of view in this particular financial year is 1 cent per kilowatt hour. So out of the 1 rand 31 cents for the capital expenditure for all those 3 projects in this financial year, the consumer paid 1 cent. So it needs to be separated out as to what is the actual cost, what are the efficient costs, and what it is that the consumer pays. So we feel that.
So effectively, what you're saying, in those operational costs, the capital expenditure incurred is included, and so consumers are paying for it.
No. The way that we recover our capital-related expenditure is through 2 items. The one is called depreciation, which is basically run by a formula, and they are, and the depreciation is recovered over the life of the asset. The other aspect, and it's linked to the recovery of the interest, is called the return on assets. Now, in this particular year that we're making the application for, we're actually asking for a negative 15 billion return on assets. So Eskom is paying in and is not asking the consumer to pay for this particular financial year, because this is the way that Eskom contributes towards the easing of the price increase. And we have traditionally done that for many years in the past. So that is the way that Eskom is contributing to making sure that there is not too much of an increase. So what I'm trying to say, on an average, for Eskom costs that are completely under the direct control of Eskom, there is between a 5 and an 8% increase.
So you're saying much of it is carbon tax, and you're saying the other half is what you're paying to independent power producers. Ted, you've read the submissions made by Eskom. Is that accurate?
Well, good evening. Firstly, I think I must take exception to the statement that Eskom is contributing 15 billion rand to a negative return towards the tariff. It's a whole lot of nonsense. Every penny in Eskom's bank account comes from you and me and the consumer in South Africa. Eskom's got no money of its own. So for Eskom to come forth and be so brash as to say that they're making a massive contribution towards the tariff is a whole lot of hogwash, and it's part of the narrative that's been going on for the last 14 years, and which is tried to hide the criminality within Eskom, as well as the inefficiency. I laugh when I hear that the Eskom only tries to recoup efficient costs. Time and time again, I have proven that Eskom's costs are inefficient, that the corruption is probably the bulk of what we are paying for. And the fact of the matter is that NERSA is totally incompetent. In the 15 years that I've been involved with the tariff applications, NERSA has not on one occasion ever done an audit on the largest cost center within the tariff, and that is the RAB, or as the lady says, the return on assets.
Sorry, Ted, I've got to come in here. Is Eskom including the consequential cost of Medupi and Kusile's failure in what they are considering prudent cost? And how do we prove that, and how do we prevent that from happening?
It's very simple. The quote I saw, the initial quote I saw for Medupi, was 34 billion. And I'll stand by that number. I've audited it. I've verified it. It's in Eskom's own archives. So the overrun is everything above 34 billion. That's where the corruption started, with scope changes, bringing in Chancellor House, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, yes, we are paying for the corruption. We are paying for the inefficiency, because under the RAB, those assets are at the corrupted values of over 150 and 200 billion. And they escalate every year, which is also a lot of nonsense. So, yes, we are paying for the overruns, the gross overruns. Ingula went from 9 billion to 40 billion rand. Kusile isn't even finished, and it's already over 150 billion rand. And what Eskom also plays with is the cost of interest during construction. The fact of the matter is both these stations are more than, I think, 8 years, 9 years overdue.
Yeah.
So there are massive escalations due to interest during construction. And that will still has to be paid by the consumer once the projects are completed.
Let's hold it there. Dr. Alex, let's bring you in here. What do you say to, please unmute for us if you can as well, Eskom saying that, well, a large part of this tariff increase is actually made up of what they're paying to independent power producers and things that are outside of their control, like carbon tax?
Yeah, well, I think that's a little bit of a selective narrative that they're putting forward. I think we do need to think, as Ted points out, that in one way or another, we do pay the costs of corruption at Medupi and Kusile. We also pay the costs of overpriced coal supply contracts, which Eskom has signed on to the tunes of trillions of dollars, according to the Special Investigative Unit report over the years. And so these massive costs that come from corrupt coal projects predominantly, I think are some of the biggest costs. And this blaming it on independent power producers, I think that's quite a selective and maybe misleading narrative. And I think there's a problem here because what we see is, particularly with renewable energy, it is the cheapest form of power we have in South Africa by far, right? And what we haven't seen is the rollout of renewables. And this is, partly Eskom to blame, but also the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. For over 6 years, they left us without any new procurement on renewables, even though it was the cheapest form of energy and one of the fastest to bring online. And so it could have also been a great job creator and would have helped us address load shedding. And the result is that Eskom is going to be burning lots of diesel and lots of coal and barely has any renewables to rely on, even though that's the cheapest energy source. And so I think blaming it on IPPs is quite rich, and then also blaming it on the carbon tax when we've been delaying the transition to renewables for year after year after year. You delay that, and then you complain about a tax because you haven't acted to clean up your act. And Eskom loves to do this. They love to claim that, it's these people that are punishing us because we're polluting. But if Eskom had taken the necessary actions to reduce their pollution, they wouldn't be paying the same level of carbon tax that they are. And so, in the end, Eskom also recoups that money from the taxpayer. So it's a really tricky narrative to blame it on taxes and IPPs when there's so much broader cost, especially in the coal sector.
Francesca, how do you feel about the fact that communities would need to actually substitute some of the more important things, for example, like food and school fees and school uniforms, just to be able to afford energy?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to hear from Eskom that the way that they calculate tariffs is from their own internal cost, which is above inflation, when we know from a study we did in 2020 that already at that time people were having to make decisions around toiletries, baby formula, travel, food, and electricity. So when you look at a 20.5% price hike for this year, and we're told, actually, no, we're giving you a special deal, it's just something that's not washing. And you can have as many formulas as you like in terms of saying how this is actually a benefit to South Africans. But the bottom line is that people can't afford electricity. And this exclusive electricity means that we are impacting the potential of development in South Africa. Our development pathway is going in the wrong direction. We see electricity prices completely beyond the reach of average South Africans. So people at the bottom of our income lines are just absolutely falling off the grid completely. It's inaccessible to them. And what Eskom is doing is losing its customers. So we're not seeing a customer-based approach from Eskom. We're also hearing, frankly, untruths about what is expensive electricity. We know mining companies, people who can afford it, they're all putting in renewable energy. Why? Because it's the most cost-effective and most reliable energy source we've got in South Africa right now. Yeah.
Right. Well,
all these untruths about what is a base load and what kind of energy does South Africa need. We can see from the decision-making and the fights, literally fights that are going on right now around where we do energy planning. Why are we still investing in coal and offshore oil? why are we still investing in nukes? Why is Eskom pushing through an extension of the nuclear power plant at Koeberg? Why are we making investments in expensive, dangerous, and risky energy systems when we know the most cost-effective, most accessible energy system is renewables? It's a global fact. It's not something that we need to debate anymore. In fact, we've seen studies that say it's actually cheaper to take your existing coal-fired power plants offline now, the functional ones, not even the ones that have problems, and invest in renewable, because it's the most effective energy system for us. We don't understand why Eskom continues in giving these myths to the general public. And I'm sorry, we're not swallowing it anymore. 20.5% increase in our electricity costs per month. Come on.
Francesca, let's take a break. I see Hasha itching to respond to some of these issues. So we'll come back to you and let you weigh in on that twice now in the response that renewables are the cheapest form of energy. Does this reflect on the balance sheet of Eskom? I suppose Hasha will let us in on those numbers when we continue in a moment. Let us in on your views tonight. 072-110-5584. Should Eskom be allowed to punish consumers in a sense with these tariff hikes for its failures? Tweet us at Newzroom 405. In Focus continues shortly. Welcome back live with us tonight here on In Focus, Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. The debate, of course, on the Eskom tariff hikes. Hasha, Tlhotlhalemaje, Francesca, Gasparis, Dr. Alex Lenferna, as well as Ted Blom in this conversation tonight, as well as your views on 072-110-5584. Otherwise, tweet us at Newzroom 405. Hasha, let's go very slowly and give you an opportunity to respond to some of the issues being raised tonight. I mean, Ted Blom seems to think it's absolute nonsense. The fact that you'd blame this on independent power producers and say you're giving back 15 billion, there's no money at Eskom, you can't be possibly giving people 15 billion, right? Dr. Alex saying that certainly blaming it on IPPs is far from the truth, because renewable energy is the cheapest form of energy. Does that reflect on your balance sheet? And maybe the other question that you should address is the carbon tax, saying you are the ones who delayed in transitioning and therefore you're being punished for that.
Okay, thank you very much, Thabo. Let me just, first of all, we, like any other business, need to recover our costs so that we can continue to provide the service. So Ted is correct in the sense that we recover our costs from selling to the consumers. And that's normal for any business. There are other sources, which would be debt and equity. Now, we all know the amount of equity injections that we've been getting. The bottom line is, we look at our efficient costs, and we do admit that there might be inefficiencies. Every business has inefficiencies, and we are dealing with that, and therefore we are getting closer to where there are not so much significant increases in our operating costs. We know about the corruption. We are dealing with the corruption. As your clip in the beginning said, whenever there is any recovery, we will provide it back to the consumer. Thus far, 2.5 billion rands in the last 2 years has been provided back to the consumer. And the other point is that we do have, for example, the municipal debt, which we're also trying to deal with from a recovery point of view. But before we get into any more details, Eskom, like many other businesses, and more so, has to depend on policy. So when sort of requests are made that Eskom must invest in renewables, Eskom would love to invest in more renewables, but it is the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy that develops the integrated resource plan, and Eskom is just the implementer of that. We have been warned by the Minister of Department of the Mineral Resources and Energy to stay in our lane. We are not the policymakers, and therefore we only implement the policy. And the other point that I want to raise is that we are looking at the facts and evidence that we need to provide to the National Energy Regulator of South Africa when we make an application. The fact is that the price, the contribution of independent power producers is increasing more so than in the recent past, and it is a key contributor to the cost. And that is an absolute fact, and it's proven in our application. The other point is also there are inefficient costs, etc. But when NERSA makes its decision and when Eskom makes its application, it needs to motivate as to why it's applying for only efficient costs. So we need to peel off the contribution from inefficiencies and prove that we are efficient. Obviously, we don't know something is corrupt when we make an application. It is something that happens afterwards, and we have always shown that we will provide that back to the consumer when the investigations are finalized. The other point is that we admit, as Francesca has pointed out, that there are certain vulnerable sectors. Now that again becomes a policy decision. It is especially the very poor residential customers, and the government and NERSA together have provided some kind of support that allows them to get a price of electricity slightly lower than what everybody else gets. And I think the bottom line, Thabo, is that if the consumer of the electricity doesn't pay for the electricity, then the taxpayer needs to pay. And there are fewer taxpayers than there are consumers. And so it's important to instill the user pay principle. And we know that Eskom has had a lot of challenges, and we're trying to deal with that one at a time, and we cannot lump everything up from an emotional point of view. Yeah. We have to have absolute fact, and I think I've mentioned earlier on is that we are saying from a regulatory point of view, it's separate from an operational point of view. The regulatory process allows us to recover from the consumer. And in our opinion, there is a good methodology that deals with that, but we are still not fully implementing that because we have, correctly so, have actually not asked for a full return on assets or even a partial return on assets. We have actually subtracted that amount, and that again is a fact.
Let's talk about that a little bit more. Full return on assets.
Yes.
Again, the chamber pointing out that you've got 18% of possible capacity that is sitting idle. In other words, 180 billion of the assets that is currently standing idle. If you look at the plant availability in 2012, sitting at 82%, and now it's sitting at 64% if you're looking at those numbers last year. So you're saying you are trying to recoup on this plant that is literally sitting there and is doing nothing, is not really serving the people of South Africa.
You know, this is a circular challenge that we're dealing with. There have been many reasons and mainly policy reasons as to why we are in the situation that we are in. We cannot, you know, these old ladies of power stations are almost my age. But I'm not giving away my age. But, you know, the average age of our power stations is about 38 years. So, you know, it's just like a car. A new car generally will work much better than an older car. But we also require maintenance, money to be able to do proper maintenance. We have to make sure that we try and minimize the load shedding to have enough capacity available at all times. So those are the various balls in the air that needs to be balanced from an operational point of view. So there should not be a situation where we have excess capacity or too much of excess capacity, but at the moment we do not have that. So it is a very complex matter to try and balance and be able to make sure that we can provide energy for most of the time. And so it's not a matter of being idle. It is that it's a figment of what the situation is, what the capacity situation is, what the maintenance situation is, what the financial situation is, as well as the skills capability within Eskom. So it is quite a complex thing that we cannot just say that you know everything must work as perfectly as when it was built in the first instance. And I think the other point that I want to point out, I think that somebody mentioned, one of the other speakers, as far as our coal costs are concerned. We did have somebody from the Mining Council present at the public hearings on Friday, and he was quite pleasantly surprised as to the kinds of contracts that Eskom has managed to secure, which is 1/3 of what it is for the industry at the moment. And that is because we spend a lot of attention on trying to get the best deal for the customers, and it is a very volatile kind of
Go very slowly for us there, Hasha. What do you mean? Because Dr. Alex says corrupt coal projects. That's the words that he used, that you guys are still involved in, that are costing you a whole lot of money.
Well, I'm sorry, but we're not aware of that. You know, there are certain aspects that are under investigations at the moment, so we'll have to wait for the outcome of that. But surprisingly, some of the contracts that we had with some of these, what you might call corrupt, were actually cheaper. And that's the feedback that we've got from our NERSA colleagues than most other mines. So I think, again, you know, just coal costing and coal, how we secure our coal is a very complex issue. And it is very easy to sit out there and say, well, I think this is corrupt, and be emotional about it. But we have to provide, and we provide thousands of pages of information to NERSA before we can make its decision. And in addition to that, we are governed by the National Treasury guidelines in the way that we secure our coal contracts. Yeah. So, you know, from an operational point of view, so there are many checks and balances, and we must admit that due to our recent past, you know, there is more eyes that are put on it, and we are very glad about that, because then we make sure that we do a more thorough job. So it is a lot of checks and balances and lots of processes that need to be followed before any coal is secured. And we can show you that in the recent past, in the last 2 years, NERSA has done its analysis and has said that Eskom can recover all of its coal costs from the consumer because they were deemed to be prudent. And so again, you know, so those kinds of things requires a lot of analysis, and it's not something that one can just talk about broadly, because there are different kinds of coal contracts.
All right.
There's long-term contracts.
We're going to take a break. We'll come to the specifics in a moment. Dr. Alex, you'll respond to that, as well as Ted, Blom, and Francesca as well. Those issues being raised around those coal contracts. What are your thoughts tonight? That is Eskom making its case here? Does it wash with you in terms of how they have arrived at these tariff hikes? And they're saying NERSA over and over again has proven that all their coal contracts or coal costs can be recovered because they are prudent. Therefore, there are no corrupt coal contracts, as far as they are concerned, that are in place. What are your thoughts? 072-110-5584. Tweet us tonight at Newzroom 405. We're back in a moment. Welcome back live with us tonight. The situation at Eskom, of course, coming under close focus in the dire times we are living in, dealing with an already suppressed economy because of structural reforms that need to be put in place, exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Consumers certainly feeling the pressure at this time. And of course, the latest application for tariff hikes by Eskom has been a concern and a cause for debate. We've got Hasha, Tlhotlhalemaje, we've got Francesca, Gasparis, we've got Dr. Alex Lenferna, as well as Ted, Blom in this conversation with us. And we'll take some of your messages as well coming through. Ted, let's go to it then. Policy doesn't sit with Eskom, it sits with government. Eskom saying, well, the shareholder actually told us to stay on our lane, and they would like to get more renewable maybe into the system, but at this particular point, it's the integrated resource plan that really determines where we go. That's the one area, but the other area is on the excess inefficient capacity, saying also that's a very complex area that in itself needs you to navigate policy as well.
Okay, so I mean, I don't know where to start, because every time Eskom comes with a whole lot of nonsense, which they expect the public to swallow. Let's just focus on, yes, the ANC is responsible. Mbeki acknowledged that in 2008. The fact of the matter is it's currently been part and parcel of court cases. And you know, and I know, that Eskom senior staff are all deployed people from the ANC. And the mess that they've made is because they've been deployed by the ANC and they weren't put there by merit. Secondly, the people at NERSA are also deployed. So now you have one deployed caterer taking on another deployed caterer. and the public is a loser. So let's park that one over there on the one side. Secondly, as far as renewables are concerned, there I have a little bit of sympathy with Eskom because and the Minister Mantas, because as much as the renewable lobby tout the IPP program in South Africa is one of the best in the world. Well, if you go and look behind the scenes, the people that are touting that are the very beneficiaries of that IPP program. In fact, the first 5 or first 4 windows of the IPP program are probably the most corrupt in the world. And that's why we've got the highest IPP tariffs in the world. And yet, these same IPP lobbyists tell you that it's the best program in the world. So I leave the public to decide on the merits of that.
Why do you say IPP, that we've got the most corrupt IPP tariffs, especially in those first 4 windows?
Because they were benchmarked incorrectly. They were benchmarked with collaboration. The IPP office was actually manned by representatives of the IPP companies, and they gave themselves a nice fat tariff, which escalates for 20 years, and very similar to the power ships tariffs, which everybody has balked about. But the IPP bid windows 1 to 4 are swallowed. They're seen as history and cannot be changed, etc., etc. But the bid window 1 especially, let's take that as an example, and they'll tell you, no, forget about bid window 1. But the fact is we're still going to pay for another 15 odd years on bid window 1, which is now running at well over 5 Rand a kilowatt hour. It's one of the most expensive in the world. So, and that is because the whole structure and the implementation of bid window 1 was corrupt from the onset. Yet those people are running around the streets, or not running, they're driving very fancy motor cars, and none of them are in jail. And that's just a testimony to what's going on in this country.
Yeah.
Then let's just get on to the coal contracts, because that's where my heart lies. Yes, the way Eskom has operated the coal stations is disgusting. I can take you to coal stations around the world, in fact, many years older than the lady from Eskom, and they are still operating perfectly. Why? Because they've been maintained properly and they haven't been as corrupted as what has happened in Eskom. So Eskom deserves every piece of punishment for the nonsense that they spew into the air, which kills people and which makes the environment generally undesirable to live in. Then in terms of coal contracts, let me take a point in case. The newest coal contract at Eskom, under the new management, was signed and implemented on the 1st of June last year. The coal price on the first day that it was under the new investment controlling shareholders was more than doubled, from 190 Rand a ton to 550 Rand a ton. I have information, and I've laid a charge, a criminal charge, together with Mr. Vavi and with Num. We have laid criminal charges against the perpetrators at Eskom. We've got the case number, and the case has died on us. Nothing has happened. The controlling shareholders of the new coal contract include Tepe Investments and Bata Trust. Now, we're going back to what happened with Medupi, with Chancellor House being the investor, and Chancellor House and Medupi gave us the most expensive coal power station in the world, and I stand corrected on that one. Yeah. So, yes, for Eskom to say they only become aware of the corruption after the fact, it's because that's what they choose to do. I've written to SAICA and I said, Eskom's got more than 24 chartered accountants who claim to be the brightest of the bunch. Yet, under their noses, and not one of them has been a whistleblower.
All right.
For the last 14, 15 years, not one of them has been a whistleblower about the inert corruption, the endemic corruption within Eskom, on the coal contracts, on buying toilet paper, on buying brooms, on car schemes with people with unlimited credit cards running around and running a whole fleet of cars on their thing. It's all happened under their noses. Right. The escalations and the changes of scope in the power stations.
All right, Ted, we'll get Eskom to respond to that particular contract, because now you've given us specifics that they would need to respond to. But
I've got a whole list of...
Yeah. Dr. Alex, nobody's driving around in your fancy cars. You're not saying anything about bid window 1 to 4, which was the most corrupt. And suppose we're still paying for that even today. Hence, the amount that appears on the balance sheet of Eskom really pointing to more and more being paid now to independent power producers.
Yeah, I don't know where to start here. It's quite astounding, the claims about corruption in the IPP program. I mean, it has been one of the cleanest energy procurements that we have in South African history in terms of questions of corruption, which is not to say there aren't issues. Those first bid windows were more expensive. It's correct. We were just introducing renewable energy into South Africa. The costs back then were higher, yes, because it was a relatively new technology. But what we've seen in the years since is that the cost of renewables have declined at an incredible rate to where they are by far the cheapest energy. Yeah. We can look to the latest IPP bid that came out after 6 years of many, many delays. It finally came out last year, and the cost of renewables that's coming from there is up to like a third of the cost of coal, half on average, right? So this is just crushing the prices of coal. You look at Eskom's own numbers, you look at the CEO, Andre Dorette, he has pointed out solar and wind is the most favorable new form of energy. The same with the Center for Scientific and Industrial Research, the University of Cape Town. All the proper energy experts will tell you that renewables is the cheapest way forward. So yes, what do we do with those earlier bid windows that were a little bit more expensive? We do need to think about that, but it's quite common for governments to subsidize new technologies, right? We've subsidized coal to the tune of trillions. And to go back to the point that I'm just emotional about corrupt coal contracts, this is not just about emotionality. The Special Investigative Unit did a report back in 2019 looking at how in 2008, during the load shedding crisis, that was used as an opportunity to sign over 14 trillion rand in overpriced coal contracts through tender programs that weren't properly done, right? Yeah. And sure, we can say maybe some of the coal supply contracts now are a bit better, right? But we are the ones still paying for those tenders that were done back then, right? So we can't just isolate the present and forget that we're still paying for those mistakes of the past. And you can do the math and try to squeeze things.
You say that, Dr. Alex. I mean, people will say exactly the same thing. I mean, we are still paying for the mistakes of the past in bid window 1 to 4 of the IPPs. That's exactly where it puts us.
I don't know if we can call that mistakes, right? And the scope, the size of the costs of those bid windows is quite small in comparison to the size of the coal bill that we're being made to pay here. I'm talking trillions. And then in the renewables case, it's in the case of billions, right? And if we look at the recent renewables, right, that's much, much cheaper. So yes, let's think about how did we subsidize those early renewable energies? Was it worth it? Yes, it's worth it because we've now got some of the cheapest energy possible. So we've seen renewables come in at this point. And look, I think we can think about what do we do with those earlier bid windows? Should we try renegotiate those prices? I don't think that's a holy cow we should never touch. But to say that like it's a mistake, I think it was a very important pathway for us to get where we are now, where renewables are in fact the cheapest technology. Right.
Francesca, what do you do in a situation where you have a country that is looking at a mixed approach when it comes to energy, and that is the policy of the country, and that's how Eskom has got to operate and operate within those confines?
Well, absolutely. I mean, one of our biggest problems, and the reason we're all sitting here this evening, is that we don't have good energy planning. We don't have a good system. It's not participatory. It's not transparent. We actually haven't implemented our own policies, government policies that should be in place. We don't update our integrated resource plan often enough. And so Eskom has got its hands tied. And I appreciate that Eskom is making efforts and that a lot of this is historic. And it's not easy to be faced with such a difficult balance sheet. And I can hear that efforts are being made. But the sense that I'm getting is that then who is accountable, right? Who is accountable? Why then, if we know that most South Africans can't afford a 20.5% increase in their electricity tariff per month, which is what we're talking about. That's what currently is at NERSA, and NERSA is deliberating on. Who then is going to pay? Because that's passing on past debt, past mismanagement, past issues onto the consumers, which we cannot afford. So that's the bottom line for me. And I know perhaps this panel here isn't able to address that question, but it is a question for the DMRE. It is a question for Treasury and for government. We need transformation of how we're doing energy. We need effective, free, basic energy so that people who can't afford it actually get access to so they don't get lost as customers to Eskom. I mean, it does make business sense, and it makes sense also in terms of our needs as South Africans and our development needs. So planning is the gap, and the elephant in the room is the lack of the DMRE, who are setting a lot of these policies and who are continuing to insist right now, as I said in my previous contribution, to favor and invest in expensive and dangerous energy systems. So this is a conversation that is going to go on for decades to come in South Africa. We're going to continue to see completely, way above inflationary increases. This is not a model that can be sustained. So I do think that it does need government intervention at other levels. It's not something that Eskom can do itself. There's been lots of conversation about transforming Eskom, but we're not seeing any real metal to get in there and make the changes that need to happen. And that's something that we need to see. That's something, a new look at debt, the debt model. What is it that we can do to make Eskom a viable entity so it doesn't have to always pass so much on to consumers? I find it strange to hear from Eskom that actually we're not passing on the complete mismanagement of our coal-fired power stations onto you consumers, but we are passing on the new renewable contracts that we're just putting out onto you, and that's where you're really having to pay. If we were a well-resourced country, and if Eskom if we didn't only have one electricity supplier, then we as consumers could say, yeah, I'm willing to pay more for renewable energy. I'm happy to do it. That's my choice. Bring it on. And that would be a model for Eskom to get investment from the consumers, from the electricity users, to pay for the renewables. But at the moment, it's just being pushed on us as consumers. We have no rights.
There have been some municipalities, though, Francesca, who say they would want to do that, but of course the constant availability of energy will then become a challenge, because if you go full on renewable, there will be some inconsistencies when the sun is not shining, when there is no wind. What do you do then?
Yeah, well, then you also can look at other models. So what do? Do you buy in some electricity? Do you store electricity? There's lots of different ways that you can address that. And countries have done that, where they've been 100% renewable at times. I'm not talking about, when we talk about choices that people make, that they invest into renewables, and this is where I don't know, maybe the woman from Eskom wasn't addressing me
Hasha,
with the emotionality, but as Hasha, thanks. As a woman, I don't like I don't like it when people use the word emotional, because I don't think that emotion is a bad thing. I think it should be we should be people, I come from a multi-faith NGO, and we are very happy to bring in moral issues to see things beyond just the balance sheet. Because if you measure everything by the balance sheet, of course, you leave out the humanity, you leave out the dignity of poor South Africans who have every right to actually also live good lives, to educate their children, to be able to afford the food and anything that they need for their families, without having to sort of feel undignified or feel emotional about it, right? So this is actually just about our basic human rights.
Let's take a break on that note, and then we'll wrap up the conversation when we return. 072-110-5584. Tweet us at Newzroom 405. Conversation continues. Welcome back. Quick look at your messages now coming through on WhatsApp, 072-110-5584. Before we wrap up the conversation tonight, Teresa in Joburg South saying our government and Eskom have dismally failed the people of this country. Until corruption is dealt with head-on, there will be no solution. Even innocent people who've been loyal to the system have lost hope. Everyone from big factories to small households are now robbing electricity because of the state of complacency from our country. Mike in Equestria saying, I totally agree with Ted. The increase is due to corruption. What has Eskom done to recover those golden handshakes of past CEOs who did not perform and was part of poor governance? Some of your thoughts tonight there on WhatsApp. Hasha, Eskom, it seems, to many people's minds, can no longer justify or at least blame its poor performance on its older coal-fired power stations. Ted saying he knows of power stations, in fact, which are older than Eskom around the world that are functioning just fine.
No, we don't have any doubt about that, but it's the complexity of trying to keep the lights on as with the limited power. And I think Ted also mentioned that our previous president, Mbeki, did realize that there was a mistake made in not timeliest decisions being made for investment. And that is, remember that in the electricity industry, it's long-term investments. One needs to make early decisions. And I think Francesca also mentioned that our IRP is outdated and we need to be, or the feeling is that it is outdated and it needs to be updated. And it does take a long time to do that. So we need to keep with the changes in the world, etc., and be able to make quick decisions. And the most important thing is implement those decisions. And you know, at one stage in the early 2000s, we were thinking that we're going to have a multi-market model, we're going to have a competition in the electricity industry. That did not materialize. And the reason why it was abandoned was that the price of electricity at that time was too low, and no investor was interested in coming into the country. Because they need to get a return on their investment. So it is a very complex issue. And I keep saying that all the time. But the other point that I just want to make is that we have done a lot of comparisons and benchmarks, and we can show that the Eskom price of electricity is lower from an industrial point of view and as well as from a residential point of view than most other countries, developing and developed countries. Yeah. But also to keep in mind that the end user sees two different prices. Just assume we're looking at a residential customer. You could have an Eskom customer that sees one price, and you could have a municipal customer that sees another price. So that is another complexity that also needs to be addressed, because you could have one Pick and Pay in one area paying much more or much less than another one. And that is because of the different ways of the way the municipalities are regulated as far as their price is concerned. Yeah. And I think to Francesca's point about vulnerable sectors, we completely are sympathetic to that, and we've said so in our public hearings. But again, this is a policy decision. There are many initiatives to protect especially the poor residential customer, and we have also made a proposal to NERSA to see whether it could provide further cross-subsidies. The thing about cross-subsidies is if we subsidize the poor residential customer, it's likely that the industrial customer has to pay a little bit more for the electricity. So that's, again, the theme of the efficient cost doesn't go away. Somebody has to pay for it.
But who's going to pay for it when the industrial players are now moving off the grid because they can now decide to produce their own? Well, let's hold that question. But deal with the contract, one that has been flagged now, the Tebe investment and the Bata contract, which were signed last year in June or July, which have more than doubled the price of coal, according to Ted. I mean, is that prudent?
I'm sorry, I don't work in that area. I work in the overall regulatory area, so I do not have any information on particular coal contracts. So I'm sorry, I would not be able to address that.
Yeah, it would be unfortunate, though, I mean, if in this new dispensation that there are still contracts that would lead to the doubling of the coal price, which in essence is what you would then pass on to the consumer. It wouldn't be prudent, would you say?
No. I think, again, you know, it is a market that, you know, and it's a very volatile market. So it depends on the timing of when contracts are done. And again, it also depends on how much it costs. And it's also the technology that is used, the kind of seams in the coal mines, etc., that will also influence how much it actually cost to get that coal out of the ground. So you know, and we had seen, again, in our public hearings, our coal experts had made a presentation that shows that adjoining mines, they just separated by one fence. The actual cost of taking that coal out of the ground varies substantially because of the nature of the mining methods that needs to be used. So I don't know about the details about the contract that Ted is talking about, but just from a general point of view, because of the volatility as well as the actual coal, coal processing, it could also influence the price.
Yeah.
So, but I cannot comment on the actual detail.
I literally have about 2 or so minutes left for all of us. So a quick 30 seconds closing remarks. Ted, why should NERSA reject this tariff increase?
Well, I think until such time as NERSA grows up and starts being honest with the public, I think that there's no chance that we will accept the stupendous increases that have come through for the last 14 years. Just as an aside, I mean, I laugh when Eskom comes up with their disingenuous argument that our electricity is cheaper than anybody else. It should be cheaper because we've got massive competitive advantages. And the reason why we're even cheaper is because of this clever ANC that crashed our currency. And that's why everybody else now looks more expensive, because our currency is so weak. So for Eskom to come with that is really shows you their decrepit thinking. I mean, I'm actually gobsmacked when they raise such nonsense every time.
Let's leave it there. Ted, Dr. Alex, quick 30 seconds, your closing remarks. Why should NERSA reject this tariff hike?
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to be having this conversation again in 2 years where we're going to be facing more price increases. And I think it's really vital that we start making the right energy decisions right now. And that's why we're calling for sort of a Green New Eskom in our campaigns, which is calling for rapid and just transition to renewable energy. And it's green not just because it cleans up the air, but because it's also the cheapest energy future. And I think, Eskom does face a difficult position because Mantashe and the DMRE are the ones holding us back from making that transition. And so we need to put a lot of pressure on there. And if Mantashe won't make the right moves and will keep trying to lock us into corrupt power ships programs or expensive new coal, then he needs to leave office. And we need to have a DMRE that won't continue to lock us into these expensive energy contracts and condemn us to a more expensive energy future, a more polluting one, and an Eskom that's crippled because it has to pay for these corrupt contracts over and over again. And as a result, we have to pay for them.
Francesca, why should NERSA reject this tariff hike application?
Well, expensive electricity is exclusive electricity, and it means that we are leaving a whole sector of our population off the grid. And that's an extremely worrying trend. I do think that Eskom and its partners in this need to look at transforming how we are charging for electricity, look at how we are offering electricity, look at some of the things around carbon offsetting that happens with exports, with exporting of energy. I mean, there's a lot happening in that sector that's actually very interesting. And there's innovation opportunity in new spaces like that Eskom seriously should be looking at and coming up with some fresh climate smart ideas. Let's see a just transition. And I know that Eskom has its hands tied in many different ways, as we've heard tonight, but really we need to see better. Right. We can't afford this kind of electricity hike.
Completely out of time. I appreciate you all. Thank you very much for coming through. That is Hasha, Tlhotlhalemaje, Francesca, Gasparis, as well as Dr. Alex Lenferna there, and Ted Blom.